for this next segment, where I'm going to give it off to my colleague Scott Schulze here, talking about some fantasy football do's and don'ts. Obviously, a lot of you have some drafts coming up probably in the next couple of weeks. You're wondering what to do. Also, this time of year, there's some weird injury stuff going on. I believe Odell Beckham Jr. had kind of an ankle injury and who might miss the first week of the season, maybe more. We don't know. But we have a resident fantasy expert in Scott Schulze. He is a perennial champion of his leagues. And the guy, gosh, you just know how to win, man. I'm envious. So what are some tips and tricks of the trade that you're looking for in 2017 in regards to folks and their fantasy football teams?
Well, I'll start with a few things Bengal related, and then afterwards, if we get any, I'll mention a few things that might be beneficial. But since we are talking about the Bengals, I'd feel remiss if I did not start with the Bengals. So that being said, there's a couple posts articles that will be coming out on Cincy Jungle probably over the next week or so about Bengals being drafted. And essentially, I first want to start with who are 3 Bengals who are going to be drafted too late in your leagues. Even if it's a league full of Bengals fans, there's 3 people who are probably going to get drafted who all of us, if you're Bengals fans, you know who they are, and you should slap yourself on the wrist for letting them go too late and not taking them. Of course, that's all subject with the asterisks of, assuming they do well, and depends on who you draft instead. And so anyway, first one is Andy Dalton, guy we were just talking about a little bit earlier. On most of the statistical projections, he projects to be about the 12th best quarterback this year in fantasy, which is pretty much starter. Which, granted, it's the bottom of the starters, serviceable starter. Yeah, he's being drafted around the 17th. Interesting thing is, you look at him; he has a ton of offensive weapons around him. We've kind of talked about that. The addition of Ross, Tyler Boyd, AJ Green, Tyler can catch the ball with Mixon and Giovanni Bernard. Obviously, his offensive line needs to keep him upright long enough, and our offensive coordinator needs to hopefully take that step forward from last year and get everything kind of put together. That being said, another thing people often overlook is Andy Dalton's not exactly a running quarterback. I mean, no one's going to confuse him with Michael Vick, but he scores a lot of running points. He has 17 rushing touchdowns over the last 5 years.
That's a great, not to interrupt you, that's a great point. And granted, they might not be. No, that's a great point for fantasy owners and a lot of people. I just want to say I usually play with a bunch of guys who are, I don't want to say Bengals haters, but they jab me a little bit about being a Bengals fan and what have you. But I tend to take Andy Dalton usually as a late round flyer pick, not only because he at times tends to hover around the 3,800, 4,000 yard passing mark when he's healthy, 25 touchdowns, that sort of thing. Not an insane amount of interceptions, but he also runs the ball into the end zone. That's a great point.
Something that a lot of people, and because people think of running quarterbacks, they think, well, you obviously have Aaron Rodgers, you have Cam Newton, will be probably more prominent in drafts. Tyrod Taylor, obviously the perfect example guy who doesn't throw but runs only. Go way back, you have guys like Michael Vick and, well, I guess even Tim Tebow. But people overlook is that Dalton, for not being a running quarterback, he gets a lot of running yards, especially when you compare him to someone like Eli Manning, Carson Palmer, or Derek Carr is probably going to have more passing stats, probably a few more touchdowns, a few more yards. But projection-wise, Andy Dalton's actually projected to get more total points because he consistently gets in the end zone. He'll get you a couple hundred rushing yards. He gets anywhere from 2 to 4 touchdowns every year. And that's something Derek Carr is not going to get you. And Andy Dalton's currently being drafted as a 17th best quarterback, which means if you really want Dalton, you could probably sit to like near the end of your draft and take him as your starter. If you're willing to roll with him, as you mentioned, he's probably more a flyer. But he's someone who's going way too late. Another one who's going way too late is the Cincinnati Bengals defense. And one thing that a lot of people may or may not notice is that defensive touchdowns basically dominate fantasy scoring for defenses. You know, those pick sixes, those fumble returns, those horribly fluky touchdowns. And every year, what happens in the draft is guys draft based on how defenses scored last year. So basically, the defenses that are being drafted this year, more often than not, are being drafted based on how many defensive touchdowns they got the year before, which is kind of a fluky stat that is, if you track that trend, which sadly I have in the past, it's not very repeatable. There's a lot of variability. Yeah, I think that's the one. Where it changes a lot from year to year. Defenses are very unrepeatable from year to year. You sometimes have a team that might be decent for a couple years in a row, but not very frequently because it's mostly defensive touchdowns. So instead of chasing that, which you can't really predict, it's much easier, or it's much better, at least in my opinion, to try to chase the things that are more predictable, more projectable, things like points against, turnovers, to some degree, sacks, which is basically, you know, how much pressure they're going to be getting. And that's an area where the Bengals do really well. They've been one of the better scoring defenses the last few years. I think a couple years ago, they were number 2. Last year, I think they were still in the top 10. Overall, their defense has added a lot better players across the board than last year. We've talked about quite a few of them on the pass rush. Obviously, we're also adding Andrew Billings, Kevin Minter, William Jackson, in addition to Lawson and Willis. And they're going undrafted in many leagues. So if you get someone that's undrafted, obviously it's a good value. So there's someone I'm going to say is not being drafted high enough. I personally would be willing to make them my starter. Granted, I wouldn't take them anywhere. You know, they'd be probably one of the last people taken. But I think there's someone who's being horribly overlooked. And then the third one I'll mention is Brandon LaFell. And the reason he's being overlooked, I think, is pretty obvious because A.J. Green and Eifert, they are the passing game. Guys like Ross, Tyler Boyd, because they're the young guys. But the team's leader in touchdowns last year. He was the number 2. Is going to have value. Now, you would need to be in a deeply draft him. I wouldn't enter small. But if you have a big enough league, he's someone I would consider probably later than he should. So that being said, I'll try to make her because we're probably not sitting with an abundance of time. So I mentioned 3 Bengals who are going too soon. Now we're looking like 3 Bengals who are going too early. Guys that you're drafting solely because of the hype or because they are Bengals and we love them, but definitely don't deserve to be going this way. We've kind of mentioned the Eifert Green. So going to get when he's long past, so most weeks he's going to get you 0, maybe once or twice this year he'll get you double digits. And unless you know what 2 weeks those are that he's going to be relevant, he's not going to give you a whole lot of value. But he's going ahead of guys like, and in some drafts even ahead of Boyd, just because he's, you know, top 10 pick, you know, that name. Who drafts him probably will be cutting him after a few weeks. So basically, when he's healthy, he is absolutely phenomenal. His touchdown rate is 1 touchdown every 6.7 catches. That's even better than Gronkowski, which is 1 out of every 6.9. So he deserves to go as high as Gronkowski goes. And if he were a 16, you know, if he was a guy who would play 16 games, he's a guy you'd be looking at end of first round, in the second round. Where it stands now, he averages 46% of the games played. So he plays less than half a year every year, which means if you draft the guy, you have to have a decent backup because you're going to be missing him for half the season. And he's had so many injuries and so many different parts of his body that you just can't trust. It's not like Geno Atkins where, okay, you had one big injury, but it's one thing. It's healed. He's better. With Eifert, it's always something. So you just don't have that confidence that he's going to be out there for more than half a season. And to use a 6th-round pick on a guy who plays a position that isn't really a premium position, that is only going to be out there half the time, just doesn't seem worth it because when it's all said and done, his yearly production is going to have him down somewhere like Kyle Rudolph, Martellus Bennett, Delaney Walker, Zach Ertz, Hunter Henry. He's going to be in that range as far as production for the year because of all the time missed, but you have to draft him 3 or 4 or 5 rounds before those guys.